The gray walls of the cell had been weighing on Kizona debtors for 3 years. Every morning began the same way: the wake-up call at 6 a.m., breakfast of thin porridge and coffee the color of dirty water, then work in the prison laundry until evening. The monotony of existence dulled the pain of separation from Tiffany, but it did not erase it completely. Every night before falling asleep, he mentally returned to their small apartment in Camden, where it smelled of her perfume and fried chicken on Sundays. Letters from his wife arrived regularly, once a week, sometimes more often. Tiffany wrote about her work in the hospital laundry, about her neighbors, about how much she missed him. Her handwriting was neat and childlike, her words simple. Kizan reread each letter dozens of times until the paper became soft from his touch. These lines held his hope for the future, that in 2 years he would be released and they would start all over again. But the letter that the guard brought on Thursday morning was different. The envelope was plain white, with no return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar and angular. Kizan first thought it was a mistake, but his name was written clearly. He opened the envelope with trembling fingers. "Your wife is fucking a freak. Every night, in your bed, she has forgotten you." Nothing else. No signature, no explanation. Kizan read the note 3 times, each word hitting his mind like a hammer blow. His hands were shaking so badly that the paper rustled. His heart was pounding in his throat, making it hard to breathe. Monster. Who was this monster? And why did someone decide to write this to him? His first reaction was denial. Tiffany couldn't have done this. She loved him, waited for him, wrote every week. But then why had her last letters become less affectionate? Why didn't she describe how she spent her evenings or tell him about her days anymore? Kizan feverishly recalled his wife's last messages. Yes, something had changed. The letters had become shorter, more formal. She wrote about the weather, about work, but not about her feelings. He threw the note on the floor and immediately picked it up. He crumpled it into a ball, then smoothed it out. The words didn't disappear. They burned his eyes and ate into his brain. Bastard. Every night. In his bed. All day long, Kizan couldn't concentrate on his work. In the laundry room, he mechanically loaded the machines and sorted the laundry, but his thoughts were far away. He imagined Tiffany with some man. He saw her kissing him, touching him as tenderly as she had once touched Kizan. Rage rose in waves, causing him to clench his fists until they hurt. His cellmate, Deshawn, noticed his state. "Why so gloomy?" he asked in the evening as they lay on their bunks in the semi-darkness. "Nothing," Kizone muttered. "Come on, man. You've been walking around like you've been hit with a brick for 3 days." Kizone remained silent. Telling him about the letter would mean admitting that Tiffany could have betrayed him, and admitting that would mean accepting that he had been living an illusion for the past 3 years. But doubts gnawed at him. Every night he lay awake analyzing his memories. Tiffany was young and beautiful. She was 27, in the prime of her life, and he was sitting in prison for armed robbery at a gas station. It had been a stupid, desperate act meant to solve their financial problems. Instead, it ruined their lives. Maybe she was tired of waiting. Maybe she had met someone who could give her what he couldn't: freedom, a normal life without shame for her convict husband. A week later, another letter arrived from Tiffany. It was ordinary, unremarkable. She wrote about the rainy weather, about the new chief physician at the hospital, about her neighbor Shante, who had gotten a cat. There was no hint that someone else had come into her life. But the former warmth was gone, too. Kizan read the letter and searched between the lines. He weighed and evaluated every word. "Kisses, Tiffany." That's how she always signed off. But before, she used to write "yours forever" or "I miss you so much I could cry." They were small things, but they added up, and then a second anonymous letter arrived. "They meet every evening. She brings him home after work. The whole neighborhood knows. You're the only fool." This time, Kizan didn't deny the obvious. The pain was so sharp, it took his breath away. He sat on his bunk, holding the letter, and felt something break inside him. Not just his heart, something more fundamental. His faith in people, in love, in the ability to trust someone. Tiffany was his whole life. He married her when she was 22 and he was 26. She worked at a dry cleaner's, he worked in a warehouse. They lived modestly but happily. Tiffany dreamed of children and a house of their own. Kizan wanted to give her all that, but they were desperately short of money, loans, bills, constant need. That's why he decided to rob the bank, for her, for their future. And now she was sleeping with another man, in their bed, which they had chosen together at a furniture store, on sheets that she had washed with her own hands. The betrayal was complete and final. The rage grew gradually. At first it was a dull pain, then a burning resentment, and now it was cold, calculating anger. Kizan knew he couldn't just sit and wait to be released, knowing what was happening at home. Every day in the dark would be torture. He began to plan his escape. Kizan had spent enough time in prison to study the routine, the weak points of the system, and the habits of the guards. Escapes were rare, but they did happen. Usually, fugitives were caught within a day, but Kizan didn't need much time. All he had to do was get home, figure out the situation, and he hadn't thought about what would happen next. The idea matured over 2 weeks. During that time, another letter arrived from Tiffany, just as empty and formal as the previous ones, and a third anonymous note. His name is Yolette. He works in a nightclub. He fucks your wife every day. Yolette. A strange name. Kizan had never heard it before. It could be male or female. But now the betrayal had a name and a face, even if it was imaginary. The escape plan was finalized. Kizan worked in a laundry, and on Thursdays he helped unload laundry from trucks that came to pick up clean laundry from hospitals and hotels. The inspection system was well established, but not perfect. If he acted quickly and decisively, he could get lost among the bags of laundry. The last night before the escape was the longest. Kizan lay on his bunk and thought about Tiffany. He remembered their first meeting in the park, where she was feeding the ducks. She laughed when one of the birds almost stole her whole bag of bread. Her laugh was clear and childlike. Kizan fell in love at first sight. Then there was their first date at the movies, where they watched a comedy and shared popcorn. Their first kiss in the rain outside her apartment building. Their wedding in a small church with only 20 people in attendance. Their honeymoon at a motel by the ocean, where they spent 3 days hardly leaving their room. It was all real. He knew it for sure. Tiffany loved him then, sincerely, with all her heart. But what happened after that? When did she change? When did she decide she didn't need him anymore? By morning, Kizan had made up his mind. He couldn't live with this knowledge. He couldn't imagine his wife in the arms of another man every day. If she had betrayed their love, their marriage, their shared past, she had to answer for it. And so did this Yolette guy. Kizan didn't know exactly what he would do when he got home, but he knew one thing. It would end exactly as it had to end. Betrayal had to be paid for, and paid for in full. Thursday began as usual. He got up at 6 in the morning, had breakfast, and lined up before work. Kizan tried to look the same as always, sullen and indifferent. Inside, he was boiling with anticipation, but his face remained a stone mask. In 3 years in prison, he had learned to hide his emotions. The laundry room was bustling with the usual activity. Machines hummed, steam rose from the hot water, and prisoners silently sorted dirty laundry. Kizan worked methodically, waiting for the right moment. The truck was supposed to arrive at 2 in the afternoon. He knew the schedule by heart. At around 1:30, he noticed movement at the entrance gate. A white van with the words "Clean City" slowly drove through the checkpoint. Kizan felt his pulse quicken. Everything was ready. A change of clothes hidden away in advance, stolen a few days earlier from the confiscated items warehouse, and a small stash of money saved up over years of work. The driver of the van was the same man who came every week, a taciturn man in his 50s. He never paid any attention to the prisoners, just checked the number of bags and signed the delivery note. The guard was also familiar, Sergeant Miller, who took his job formally and was often distracted by phone calls. When they started loading the bags, Kizan worked especially hard. He carried heavy bundles, helped other prisoners, and pretended to be diligent. Miller stood aside, leafing through some papers. The driver smoked near the cab. The moment came when the van was almost full. Kizan picked up the last bag and pretended to trip. The bag fell, and the laundry scattered on the ground. While everyone rushed to gather the sheets and towels, he quickly climbed into the back and buried himself under a pile of bags in the far corner. His heart was beating so loudly that it seemed everyone around him could hear it. Kizan lay motionless, trying to breathe as quietly as possible. The bags were heavy and pressed against his back. He couldn't breathe, but he endured. The main thing was not to move. He heard voices and the tailgate slammed shut. The engine started. The van slowly pulled away. Kizan knew that they were now passing through the main gates of the prison. If they found him, it would be all over. Escaping from a maximum security prison would add several years to his sentence. But the van didn't stop. It drove through the grounds, then onto the road, picking up speed. Kizan felt them turn right, which meant they were heading toward the city. 10 more minutes and he would be free. He got out of the van at a laundry warehouse in an industrial area. The driver had gone to fill out paperwork, and the area was empty. Kizan quickly changed into the clothes he had hidden, jeans and a dark shirt, and climbed through a hole in the fence. The street seemed deafeningly loud after the silence of the prison. Cars, people, music from shops, everything mixed into a cacophony of sounds. Kizan walked quickly but not running, trying not to attract attention. It was 20 kilometers to his house, but he knew the way. The bus took him to a familiar neighborhood. Camden greeted him with peeling facades, graffiti on the walls, and the smell of fried food from fast food joints. Nothing had changed in 3 years. The same faces on the streets, the same broken sidewalks, the same atmosphere of hopelessness. The house where he and Tiffany had rented an apartment was at the end of the street. It was a 2-story brick building with peeling paint and rusty gutters. Their windows were on the 2nd floor, overlooking the courtyard. Kizan remembered every detail: how the stairs creaked, how the front door lock stuck, how the stairwell smelled of cat urine and cheap cigarettes. He didn't go home right away. First, he had to make sure that the anonymous letters were true. He went into a diner across the street and ordered a coffee. He sat down by the window, from where he could see their house. He didn't have to wait long. At 6:15, a familiar figure appeared on the street. Tiffany walked slowly, tiredly, her bag pulling her shoulder down. She looked almost the same as she had 3 years ago, only a little fatter and sadder. Her hair was tied back in a ponytail, and she was wearing a hospital laundry uniform, blue pants and a white blouse. Kizan looked at his wife and felt a strange mixture of tenderness and rage. She was still beautiful, still the woman he loved, but now she belonged to someone else. Tiffany entered the building. A few minutes later, the light came on in their window. Kizan could see her silhouette moving around the apartment, doing something, probably making dinner, for 2. He waited an hour, then another half hour. It grew dark, and the streetlights cast a dim light on the wet asphalt. And then Kizan saw him. The man walked down the street confidently, clearly knowing where he was going. He was tall and slender, wearing tight jeans and a leather jacket. His hair was long, down to his shoulders, and his gait was slightly feminine. His face was indistinguishable in the darkness, but something about his figure seemed strange. Too graceful for a man, too smooth. The stranger stopped at their door, took out his keys, and opened the door. He had keys to their house. Kizan clenched his fists so tightly that his knuckles turned white. A few minutes later, the light in the window grew brighter. Another lamp had been turned on. Then the curtains were drawn. Kizan stared at the illuminated window and imagined what was happening inside. Tiffany was greeting her lover with a kiss. They were having dinner at the table where he and his wife had once dined. Then they would go to the bedroom, to their bed. Rage rose in waves, making his hands tremble. Kizan ordered another coffee and continued watching. He needed to find out more about this man, to understand who he was and how he had entered Tiffany's life. Around 9 o'clock in the evening, the curtains opened. 2 figures appeared in the window, Tiffany and her lover. They stood embracing, the woman saying something, the man nodding. Then they kissed, long and passionately. Kizan turned away, unable to watch. When he looked at the window again, there was no one there. The light stayed on until 10:30, then went out. Kizan imagined them going to bed in his bed, hugging under the blanket he had bought for Tiffany's birthday. He spent the night in an abandoned building nearby. He couldn't sleep. Images of betrayal, plans for revenge, and memories of the past swirled in his head. By morning, he had made his final decision. The next day was Friday. Kizan took up his observation post in the cafe again and waited. Tiffany left for work at the usual time at 7:30. He followed her, keeping his distance. The hospital was a 10-minute walk away. It was an old red brick building where Tiffany worked in the basement, in the hospital laundry. Kizan remembered how she had described her job in her letters. It was hard, dirty, poorly paid, but stable. He waited until his wife had disappeared into the building, then went to look for this Yolet. The letter said he worked in a nightclub. There weren't many clubs in their neighborhood, 2 or 3 establishments of dubious reputation. The first club was closed. Too early. The second was open, but the bouncer said he didn't know anyone named Yolet. At the third club, the Golden Fever, Kizan got lucky. "Yolet?" asked the bartender, a skinny guy with tattoos on his arms. "Who are you?" "A friend," Kizono lied. "I wanted to meet her. She works in the evenings. She dances. Come back after 10. She'll be there." So Yolet was a woman. But the anonymous letter had mentioned a man, or someone who was considered a man. Kizono was beginning to understand. He wandered around the city all day, thinking about the situation. So his wife was cheating on him with a woman. That was even worse than with a man. At least a man could give her what he couldn't: freedom, protection, money. But a woman? What could a woman give her that he couldn't? By evening, he returned home. He took up his position in the cafe again and waited. At 6:30, Tiffany arrived. At 7, Yolet arrived. This time, Kizan looked closely at her face, beautiful, feminine, but with a certain harshness in her features. Long hair, bright makeup, narrow hips. Definitely a woman, but something about her was wrong. They had dinner like lovers. Kizan saw their silhouettes in the window. They sat close to each other, touching, laughing. His wife looked happy, happier than she had ever been with him. That was the last straw. Kizan couldn't watch anymore. He knew what he had to do. Revenge was the only way to restore justice. Tiffany had betrayed their marriage, their love, everything they had built together. She had to pay for that. He waited until the lights went out in the window and went to get ready. In the abandoned building where he spent the night, he found a piece of rebar, heavy and comfortable to hold. That was enough. Tomorrow, it would all be over. Tiffany would learn what it meant to betray her husband, and Yolet would realize that she shouldn't have meddled in someone else's family. Saturday began with rain. Gray clouds hung low over the city. Raindrops drummed on the roofs and windows. Kizan woke up early before dawn to the sound of water running down the drain pipe of the abandoned building. He hadn't slept all night, lying on an old mattress he had found among the rubbish, thinking over his plan. He clutched a piece of rebar in his hand. The cold metal was calming, giving him a sense of control over the situation. All those years in prison, he had been powerless, unable to protect his wife, unable to control her life, unable even to know the truth about what was happening at home. Now everything had changed. The rain grew heavier. Kizan looked out the broken window and scanned the street. There were few cars, and pedestrians hurried along under umbrellas and hoods. Good. In weather like this, people paid less attention to their surroundings. He knew Tiffany's Saturday routine. She used to get up late around 10, then go to the store for groceries. She would return around noon and do housework. In the evenings, they would watch movies or just talk. Those were their best days, quiet, at home. Now everything was different. Now she spent her Saturdays with Yolet. At 9 in the morning, Kizan took up a vantage point in the doorway of a neighboring building. From there, he had a good view of their apartment. It was raining cats and dogs, and there were almost no passers-by. Perfect conditions. At 9:30, Yolet came out of the building. She was wearing a bright jacket and jeans with an umbrella in her hand. She was walking quickly, clearly in a hurry. Kizan waited a few minutes and followed her. Yolet headed toward the city center. Kizan kept his distance, hiding around corners and in doorways. The woman went into a 24-hour supermarket and came out with a large bag of groceries. Then she stopped at a pharmacy and a flower shop. She was shopping as if for a romantic evening. This triggered a new wave of rage. Yolet had planned to spend the day with his wife and was preparing a surprise. in the house that Kizan had rented with the money he had earned before his arrest. She was acting like the mistress of the house, as if she had a right to this life. Around noon, Yolette returned home. Kizan saw her climbing the stairs with her purchases. Two figures appeared in the window of their apartment. Tiffany was helping her unpack the bags. They moved in sync, as if they had been living together for a long time. Kizan waited until evening. He sat in the cold stairwell, watching the windows, planning his every move. The rain didn't stop, which was convenient. It muffled the sounds and reduced visibility. A warm light shone in their window. From time to time, silhouettes flashed by. Women were preparing dinner and setting the table. Kizan imagined the smells that filled the apartment. Tiffany was a good cook, which was one of the reasons he fell in love with her. She knew how to make simple dishes special. Around 8 in the evening, he noticed movement on the stairs. Someone was coming down, heavy footsteps, a man's voice muttering something under his breath. It was the neighbor from the first floor. Kizan remembered him. A drunk who worked as a porter and got drunk every weekend until he passed out. This was lucky. If the neighbor was drunk, he wouldn't pay attention to strange noises coming from the apartment above. Kizan waited another hour. Candles were lit in the window, apparently a romantic dinner. Silhouettes sat opposite each other, leaning across the table, touching hands. The scene would have been idyllic if he hadn't known the truth. At 9:30, he made up his mind. The pipe lay heavy in his hand, rain drummed on the roof. Kizan came out of hiding and headed for his home. The front door was unlocked. The lock had broken before he was arrested, and the management company was in no hurry to repair it. The stairs creaked under his feet, but the rain drowned out the sound. On the second floor, he stopped in front of a familiar door. He didn't have the keys. They had been taken from him when he was arrested. But the lock was old and unreliable. Kizan remembered that the door could be opened with a credit card if you knew where to press. He tried it. The lock clicked and gave way. The apartment greeted him with warmth and familiar smells. It smelled of food, candles, and women's perfume. But there was another smell, foreign, not belonging to this house, the smell of Yolette. Quiet voices and laughter came from the living room. Kizan cautiously walked down the hallway to the door. Through the crack, he could see the edge of a table, burning candles and wine glasses. The women were sitting with their backs to the door, unaware of his presence. "I haven't been this happy in so long," said Tiffany. Her voice was soft and content. "With you, everything seems possible." "I'm happy with you too," replied Yolette. Her voice was low, slightly hoarse. "I thought I'd never be able to love anyone truly." "What about your husband?" Yolette asked. "Do you still think about him?" Tiffany paused. Kizan tensed, waiting for her answer. "Sometimes I do," she said finally. "I feel sorry for him, but that was a different life. I was a different person. With you, I realized who I really am." "What if he comes back?" "I don't know. I hope we can talk calmly, explain to him that everything has changed, that I've changed." Kizan gripped the rebar tighter. So she was going to leave him when he got out of prison. Not even wait for him to return to talk in person. Just present him with a fait accompli. He pushed the door. It swung open with a loud creak. The women turned around at the same time. Their faces showed shock, fear, and confusion. Tiffany turned pale, her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Yolette instinctively moved away, knocking over a chair. "Hi, honey," Kizan said quietly. "I'm home." Tiffany stood up slowly, holding onto the edge of the table. Her hands were shaking, her eyes wide open. "Kizan? When did you?" "I ran away," he replied simply. "Just for you. I wanted to surprise you." He looked at his wife and saw her trying to collect her thoughts. She was beautiful in the candlelight, her face soft, her hair loose, wearing the dress he remembered. But now that beauty belonged to someone else. "Kizan, I need to explain something to you," Tiffany began. Her voice trembled, but she tried to control herself. "Explain?" he sneered. "What is there to explain? It's all clear." Yolette tried to stand up, but Kizan turned to her and showed her the bar. The woman froze. "Sit down," he said to her. "No rush. We'll talk about this together. Kizan, listen to me. Tiffany took a step forward. It's not what you think. What do I think? He asked, not taking his eyes off Yolet. That my wife is fucking a freak in our bed. That she forgot about me while I was in prison for trying to give her a better life. I didn't forget about you, Tiffany said quietly. I never forgot. But I've changed, Kizan. I've learned things about myself that I didn't understand before. You realized you love women? I realized I love Yolet. Simple words, spoken calmly, but they hurt more than any insult. Kizan felt something inside him break completely. 5 years of marriage, he said slowly. 5 years I thought you loved me, and it turns out you just didn't know yourself. I loved you, Tiffany replied, in my own way, but it wasn't the kind of love it should have been. I couldn't understand that then. And now you can? Now I know what real feelings are. Kizan laughed, short, angry. Yolet tried to say something, but he turned sharply toward her. Shut up, you're not needed here. She's not needed, Tiffany interjected. She's part of my life now. Your life? Kizan exploded. What life? You're my wife, this is my house. This is my bed you're sleeping in with her. Kizan tried to understand. Understand what? That you're a whore? That you betrayed everything we had? Tiffany flinched as if she had been struck. Yolet stood up, shielding her with her body. Don't you dare talk to her like that, she said firmly. Who are you to tell me what to do? Kizan took a step toward her, clenching the rebar. You broke my family, stole my wife, and you have the nerve to talk to me? I didn't steal anyone, Yolet replied. Tiffany made her own choice. Choice? What choice? Between her husband and a pervert? Between the past and the future? Tiffany said quietly. Between who I was and who I want to be. Kizan looked at his wife for a long time. Her eyes showed determination. She wasn't going to apologize or ask for forgiveness. She was defending her choice, her new life. So it's over, he said. Our marriage, our love, it's all over. I'm sorry it turned out this way, Tiffany replied. But yes, it's over. Those words finally broke something inside Kizan. All the pain, all the rage, all the humiliation of the last few weeks concentrated in one point. He raised the rebar. Then you have no reason to live. Yolet screamed and rushed forward, but it was too late. Kizan struck with all his might. Metal met skull with a loud thud. Tiffany fell without a sound. Blood began to spread across the floor, mixing with wax from the fallen candles. Kizan stood over his wife's body and felt a strange emptiness. The rage disappeared as suddenly as it had appeared. All that remained was deafening silence. Yolet sobbed, trying to lift Tiffany, but it was too late. His wife's eyes stared at the ceiling, unblinking. What have you done? Yolet whispered through her tears. What have you done? Kizan looked at the blood on the rebar and realized that there was no turning back. Now he was a murderer. Now it was really over. The silence in the apartment was deafening. Kizan stood over his wife's body, holding the bloody rebar in his hand, unable to believe what had just happened. A second ago, Tiffany was alive, talking to him, explaining her feelings. Now she lay motionless, blood slowly spreading across the floor. Yolet continued to sob, pressing her hands against Tiffany's face, trying to find signs of life. Her shoulders shook with sobs, and she muttered something through her tears. Tiffany's name, fragments of prayers, incoherent words of despair. She's dead, Kizan said quietly, more to himself than to Yolet. The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with hatred and horror. You killed her, she whispered. You killed the most beautiful person in the world. Kizan looked at the rebar in his hand. The metal was warm from the blood, slippery. He unclenched his fingers, and the murder weapon fell to the floor with a dull thud. The reality of what had happened began to sink in. He had escaped from prison. He had killed his wife. Now he was a criminal twice over, a fugitive and a murderer. He faced life imprisonment or the electric chair. We have to go, he said, more to himself than to Yolet. Where can we go? She sobbed. You're a murderer. You have to answer for this. Shut up, Kizan snapped. If it weren't for you, none of this would have happened. You destroyed our family. Yolet stood up slowly, her eyes fixed on Tiffany's body. Her face was pale, her lips trembling. "I loved her," she said quietly. "I gave her what you couldn't give her. Understanding, acceptance, true love." "Real love?" Kizan snorted. "Pervert is what you call it." "You don't understand love," Yolet replied. "If you did, you wouldn't have killed her." Kizan wanted to hit her too, but he restrained himself. One murder was enough for today. Besides, he had to think about his escape. Sooner or later, someone would find the body. The neighbors might have heard the screams. The police would start searching. "What are you going to do?" he asked Yolet. "I'll call the police," she replied firmly. "I'll tell them you killed Tiffany." "And what were you doing here?" Yolet fell silent. Kizan saw understanding in her eyes. If she told the truth about her relationship with Tiffany, she would become the prime suspect. A mistress is always the first suspect. "They'll think you killed her," Kizan continued, "out of jealousy or for the money." "Do you have an alibi?" "I was here," Yolet whispered. "So you had the opportunity and the motive, jealousy, money, whatever. Do you think the police will believe that a man who escaped from prison happened to show up just as you were having dinner with his wife?" Yolet looked at him in horror. Kizan could see the picture forming in her mind. No witnesses, no alibi, a motive. She was the perfect suspect. "What do you want?" she asked. "Time," Kizan replied. "Don't call the police for at least an hour. Let me leave. And then do whatever you want. Say whatever you want. But remember, you were here when she died. That makes you an accomplice." Kizan quickly scanned the apartment. He had to take everything he needed and disappear. Money. Tiffany always kept a stash of cash in her bedroom. Clothes. His things were still in the closet. Documents. No, they had been taken during the arrest. Everything in the bedroom was as it had been, except the bed had been made with fresh sheets. Kizan opened the familiar nightstand and found an envelope with money, about $300. That would be enough for a few days. He took a warm jacket and a change of underwear from the closet. Yolet stood motionless in the living room, staring at Tiffany's body. She was no longer crying. The shock had apparently dulled her emotions. "Remember," Kizan said as he passed her on his way out, "an hour of silence. It's in your best interest, too." Yolet didn't answer. Kizan left the apartment and quietly closed the door behind him. The stairwell was dark and quiet. The rain was still pouring down, drumming on the roof. Kizan descended cautiously, trying not to creak the steps. On the first floor, drunken muttering came from behind the door. The neighbor was still drinking. At midnight, 2 men in uniform entered the hall. They were regular patrol officers, nothing special, but Kizan instinctively tensed up. They slowly walked around the hall, checked the documents of several suspicious individuals, and talked to the security guards. One of the policemen approached the information desk and asked the woman on duty something. She pointed toward the waiting room. Kizan felt his blood run cold. They were looking for him. So Yolet had called the police after all, or someone else had found the body. The police officers split up and began to slowly circle the hall, checking the faces of the passengers. There were only a few rows of seats left before Kizan reached the front. He stood up and headed for the restroom, trying not to rush. The restroom was empty. Kizan locked himself in a stall and began to think. It was dangerous to leave. The police could spot him. But he couldn't stay there either. Sooner or later, they would check the restroom. He waited 10 minutes and cautiously peeked out. There were no police officers in the hall. Perhaps they had left after checking all the passengers. Kizan left the restroom and headed for the boarding platform. The bus was already at the platform. The driver was checking tickets, and passengers were taking their seats. Kizan stood in line, trying not to stand out. In front of him was an elderly woman with bags, and behind him was a young man with headphones. "Ticket," said the driver. Kizan handed him his ticket with a trembling hand. The driver glanced at him and nodded. In a few seconds, he would be on the bus, on his way to freedom. "Stop! Police!" The voice came from behind, loud and authoritative. Kizan turned around and saw 2 policemen quickly approaching the bus. Passengers began to turn around and make noise. "Everyone stay where you are!" shouted one of the policemen. "We're looking for a fugitive!" Kizan tried to hide among the passengers, but it was too late. The policeman pointed at him. That one in the jacket! Hands on your head! For a few moments, Kizan thought about resisting. He could push the cop, grab his weapon, and try to escape. But there were innocent people around, and he didn't have the strength for another fight. He slowly raised his hands and dropped to his knees. Cold handcuffs snapped shut around his wrists. The police officers lifted him off the ground and read him his rights. A crowd of onlookers gathered around, some filming with their phones. "Kizan Debtors, you are under arrest on suspicion of murder," said the senior police officer. "Everything you say may be used against you in court." Kizan listened to the familiar words and realized that it was all over. His escape had ended before it had even begun. Now he faced trial, a sentence, possibly the death penalty. He sat silently in the police car, staring out the window at the passing city lights. The rain was still pouring down, blurring the outlines of the buildings. Somewhere out there, in their apartment, Tiffany's body lay. Somewhere out there, Yolette was telling the detectives what she had seen. Kizan closed his eyes and tried not to think about the future. For now, he was just a passenger in a police car taking him to the station. Everything else, the trial, prison, execution, was somewhere ahead, in a foggy and frightening tomorrow. The car stopped at the police station. The police officers took Kizan out and led him inside, through brightly lit corridors to a holding cell. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang. Kizan was left alone in a small cell with a cot, a sink, and a toilet. It was exactly the same as the one he had left a few days ago. Only now he was not just a robber but a murderer. The holding cell was even smaller than the one where Kizan had spent the last 3 years. Gray walls pressed in on all sides. The only window was barred and faced the inner courtyard of the station. Through it, he could see neither the sky nor the street, only the brick wall of the neighboring building. Kizan sat on his bunk and stared into space. His wet clothes clung to his body, and the cell was cold, but he didn't notice the discomfort. All his thoughts were focused on what had happened a few hours ago, on Tiffany's face at the moment of impact, on the sound of rebar hitting her skull, on the blood spreading across the floor of their living room. He had killed his wife. The woman he loved more than life itself. The woman for whom he had committed robbery. The woman for whom he had spent 3 years in prison. And now she was dead, killed by his own hand. The first feeling was emptiness, complete, all-consuming emptiness, as if a black hole had formed inside him, sucking in all his emotions. Then came the pain, sharp, physical, causing him to curl up into a ball on the cot. And only then did he try to understand how it had happened. He hadn't planned to kill Tiffany. He had planned to talk, to sort things out, maybe scare her lover away. But when he saw them together, when he heard his wife talk about her feelings for another woman, something inside him broke completely. Tiffany said it was over, that their marriage, their love was in the past, that she had changed and couldn't be with him anymore. Those words led to tragedy. Kizan tried to find excuses for his actions. Tiffany had betrayed him. She had cheated on him with a pervert. She had forgotten about her husband, who was in prison for their future. She deserved to be punished. But no matter how many times he repeated these arguments, they sounded empty and false. The truth was simpler and more terrifying. He killed his wife because he couldn't accept her choice, because he considered her his property, because his pride was more important than her life. Around midnight, footsteps could be heard in the hallway. Keys jangled in the lock and the door opened. A tall black man in a suit entered the cell, a detective, judging by the badge on his lapel. "Kizan Debtors," he said without asking a question. "Detective Callis Enright, we need to talk." Kizan raised his head and looked at the detective. His face was tired but attentive. His eyes were searching, professional. Kizan had seen many like him. They knew how to read people like an open book. "I have the right to an attorney," Kizan said. "You do," Enright agreed. "But for now, we can just talk, unofficially." He sat down on the only chair in the cell, took out a notepad and a pen. "Tell me what happened tonight." Kizan remained silent. The detective waited patiently, studying his face. Finally, Kizan spoke. "I escaped from prison. I came home. I found my wife with her lover. We got into a fight. I hit Tiffany. She died." "What did you hit her with?" "A piece of rebar. I found it at a construction site." "Why did you escape?" Kizan paused, searching for the right words. I got a letter. Someone wrote that my wife was cheating on me. I wanted to find out the truth. And did you find out? Yes. Enright made notes in his notebook without looking up. Did you plan the murder? No, Kizan replied quickly. I just wanted to talk to her. But you took a piece of rebar with you. For protection. It's dangerous on the streets. Who were you defending yourselves from at home? From your wife? Kizan realized he had trapped himself. The detective was experienced and knew how to ask the right questions. I got angry, he said honestly, when I heard that she didn't love me anymore. That it was over between us. And you decided that if she wasn't yours, she wasn't anyone's? I didn't think so, Kizan objected. I just couldn't control myself. Enright raised his head and looked at him for a long time. Do you have any children, Mr. Detters? No. Parents? My mother is dead. I don't know my father. So Tiffany was the only person close to you? Yes. And you killed her. The words were simple, without accusation, but they hit harder than any reproach. Kizan felt a lump rise in his throat. I didn't mean to, he whispered. It just happened. Nothing just happens, Enright replied. You made a choice. You picked up the pipe, raised your arm, and struck her. Those were your decisions. She betrayed me, Kizan tried to justify himself. She slept with another man while I was in prison for her. For her? You robbed a gas station for her? I wanted to give her a better life. We didn't have enough money and we were in debt. I thought if I took a chance, we'd be free. But you became even less free. You went to prison, and she was left alone. I thought she would wait. 3 years is a long time for a young woman, Enright said, especially when she realizes she didn't really know herself. What do you mean? Yolet told us about your relationship with your wife, about how Tiffany struggled for a long time to understand her sexual orientation, that your marriage was an attempt to conform to social expectations. Kizan felt a new wave of anger rising. She's lying. Tiffany loved me. Truly. Perhaps, the detective agreed, but not the way you wanted her to. And when she realized that, she told you honestly. Honestly? Kizan exploded. It would have been honest to say so before you cheated on her. Would you have given her that opportunity? Would you have listened calmly? Would you have let her go without a fight? Kizan opened his mouth to answer, but fell silent. No, he wouldn't have listened calmly. He wouldn't have let her go without a fight. Tiffany knew his character, knew that he would try to keep her at any cost. She was afraid of you, Enright continued. Yolet says that Tiffany hesitated for a long time before starting a relationship because she was afraid of your reaction. So she knew she was doing something wrong. She knew she was doing something that might make you angry. Those are two different things. Kizan thought about the detective's words. It seemed that Tiffany had struggled with her decision. She had struggled with herself, trying to understand her feelings. And all that time, he had been sitting in prison, unaware of her inner turmoil. I loved her, he said quietly, more than anything in the world. Love doesn't give you the right to control someone else's life, Enright replied. And it certainly doesn't give you the right to take that life away. What will happen to me? Kizan asked after a long silence. Trial. If you plead guilty, you may be able to avoid the death penalty. Life imprisonment is the most likely sentence. Life, yes. You will never be free again. Kizan tried to imagine that prospect. Endless years in a cell, with no hope of release, without Tiffany, who would no longer write letters, without the future they had planned together. What about Yolet? What about her? Will she be arrested too? For what? She didn't commit a crime. She witnessed a murder, but that doesn't make her a criminal. She destroyed my family. You destroyed your family, Enright said harshly. First with the robbery, then with the murder. Yolet had nothing to do with it. The detective stood up and put his notebook in his pocket. Think about what we've discussed. Tomorrow morning you'll be taken to court for sentencing. I advise you to get a lawyer and plead guilty. It's the only way to avoid the death penalty. The cell door slammed shut. Kizan was left alone with his thoughts. He thought about Tiffany, about their first meeting, about their wedding, about their plans for the future, about everything they had lost because of his stupidity and pride. If he hadn't gone on the robbery, she wouldn't have been left alone. She wouldn't have met Yolette. She wouldn't have realized that she could love someone else. And even if that had happened, he could have done things differently. He could have listened to her explanations. He could have tried to understand. He could have let her go in peace if she was truly happy with someone else. But instead, he chose violence. He decided that his pain was more important than her life, and now Tiffany was dead, and he would spend the rest of his days in a prison cell. Kizan lay down on his bunk and closed his eyes. Tomorrow the trial would begin, followed by long years of imprisonment. But he had already received the worst punishment: the realization that he had killed the only person he had ever truly loved. Dawn was breaking outside the window. Gray light filtered through the bars, slowly dispelling the darkness in the cell. Somewhere out there in the city, people were waking up, going to work, making plans for the future. And he was stuck in this cell forever, burdened by his irreparable mistake. Life was truly over. Not just Tiffany's, but his own as well. Now all he had left was to live out the rest of his days, knowing that he had destroyed everything that was dear to him.